The ocean was perfect that morning. Glassy waves, golden light, the kind of day surfers dream about for weeks. He paddled out with a smile on his face, salt water on his lips, and not a single worry in the world. Then the water moved, not like a wave, not like a current, something else, something massive, something ancient, something that had been watching him from below for longer than he knew. In one catastrophic instant, the ocean exploded. The screams on the beach came before anyone even understood what they were seeing. And when the chaos finally settled, what that enormous creature did next left every single witness completely and utterly speechless. To understand what happened that morning, you first need to understand the creature at the center of this story. Because this was no ordinary animal. This was an orca. And if you think you already know what that means, think again. Most people hear the word orca and picture a theme park. Black and white colors, a friendly wave, a trained performer jumping through hoops for a crowd of clapping tourists. But that image, that comfortable, domesticated image, is perhaps the greatest lie the ocean has ever told us. Because in the wild, the orca is something else entirely. Something that commands every corner of every ocean on this planet. Something that even the great white shark fears. Scientists call them Orcinus orca. The name itself carries weight. In ancient times, sailors called them whale killers, and over centuries that name slowly flipped into the gentler killer whale. But neither name truly captures what they are. They are the apex predator of the sea. Not just powerful, not just fast, not just enormous, though they are all of those things. They are intelligent, frighteningly, almost uncomfortably intelligent. Orcas have brains that are 4 times the size of a human brain. They possess a region of neural tissue that neuroscientists believe is linked to complex emotional processing. Something even humans don't fully have. They feel, they grieve, they remember, they plan, and they communicate. Not in simple grunts or calls like most marine animals. Orca pods, the family groups they live in, each have their own dialect, their own unique language. A set of clicks, whistles, and calls that belong only to them, passed down from mother to calf across generations. Scientists have studied these dialects for decades and are still unraveling their complexity. These are not animals operating on blind instinct. These are creatures with culture. An adult male orca can grow to 30 feet in length. That is longer than a city bus. It can weigh up to 22,000 pounds, roughly the same as 3 full-grown African elephants standing side by side. Its dorsal fin alone can reach 6 feet tall. When an orca breaches the surface, when it launches its full body out of the water and crashes back down, the impact can be felt hundreds of meters away. The sound is like a thunderclap. The spray reaches 20 feet into the air. It is one of the most breathtaking sights in all of nature, and one of the most terrifying. Orcas hunt in packs, family units that operate with the precision and coordination of a military squad. They have been observed working together to create waves that wash seals off ice floes. They have been seen teaching their young how to beach themselves temporarily on shore to catch prey, and then how to wriggle back into the water safely. Have been documented following fishing boats for hours, learning the patterns of the fishermen, and then strategically stealing fish directly from the lines in a way that is almost impossible to prevent. They are problem solvers. They are strategists. They are, in every meaningful sense of the word, hunters. And they are extraordinarily good at it. In the wild, there are no recorded cases of an orca killing a human being. Let that sink in for a moment. An animal that hunts great white sharks for sport. An animal that can crush a boat with its tail. An animal fast enough to outrun most vessels on the open water, and it has never, in all of recorded natural history, killed a human in the wild. That fact has fascinated and puzzled researchers for years. Some believe orcas are simply too intelligent to view humans as prey. Others suggest that somewhere in their complex social memory, orcas have developed an understanding of humanity, a curiosity, rather than an aggression. But here is what those researchers also say. That does not mean orcas are safe. That does not mean they are predictable. And it absolutely does not mean that a 30-foot, 20,000-pound apex predator cannot cause catastrophic harm, whether it intends to or not. In recent years, Something strange has been happening in the waters off the coast of Europe. Groups of orcas, particularly around the Strait of Gibraltar, have begun approaching sailing boats and attacking their rudders. Dozens of incidents. Several boats sunk. No one fully understands why. Some researchers believe it began with a single traumatized female orca nicknamed White Gladys, who may have had a violent encounter with a vessel and began teaching the behavior to others in her pod. Others believe it is play behavior that escalated. Others simply do not know. What everyone agrees on is this: something has shifted. Something in the relationship between these ancient creatures and the humans who share their ocean has changed. And no one can say with certainty where that change will lead. So when that surfer paddled out into those beautiful, glittering waters that morning, he was entering a world that operated entirely on its own terms. A world that had existed for millions of years before the first human being ever touched the sea. A world ruled not by lifeguards and surf competitions and safety flags, but by something far older, far larger, and on that particular morning, far closer than anyone could have possibly imagined. His name was Marcus. And if you had to describe him in a single sentence, it would be this: he was a man who had never truly felt alive anywhere except in the water. Marcus Webb was 34 years old, broad shoulders, sun-darkened skin, hands that were permanently rough from years of gripping a surfboard in cold salt water. He had the kind of quiet confidence that comes not from arrogance, but from a man who has found exactly what he was put on this earth to do and has been doing it every single day without apology. He grew up in a small coastal town in California, the kind of town where the ocean is not a destination. It is a way of life, where kids grow up knowing the names of the waves the way city kids know the names of streets, where the smell of sunscreen and salt water is so woven into your childhood that decades later, one single breath of ocean air can take you straight back to being 8 years old again. Marcus was 6 years old the first time he stood on a surfboard. He still remembered that moment with perfect clarity. His father, a weathered fisherman named Ray, who had spent his entire life on the water, had placed a battered old longboard under his son's feet in the shallow shore break and held his hands as the first tiny wave rolled in beneath them. And Marcus had stood up, wobbly, terrified, laughing so hard he could barely breathe. And in that single moment, in that 3 seconds of standing on moving water with his father's hands letting go, something locked into place inside him that would never unlock again. He was home. By the time Marcus was 12, he was surfing waves that made the other parents on the beach cover their eyes. By 15, he was competing at regional level and winning. By 18, he had turned down a college scholarship to pursue surfing full-time, a decision that horrified his bot and quietly made his father proud in a way the old man never quite found the words to express. The professional circuit was brutal. The travel was relentless. The competition was filled with young men and women who were faster, more flexible, more fearless. Marcus won some contests. He lost more than he won. He broke his left wrist in a wipeout in Hawaii at 22 and spent 4 months staring at a cast and wondering if that was the end. It was not the end. He came back stronger, more patient, with a deeper understanding of the ocean that only time and pain can teach you. By his late 20s, Marcus had stepped back from full-time competition, not because he had failed, but because he had realized something important about himself. He did not love surfing because of the trophies. He did not love it because of the crowds or the sponsorships or the social media following he had quietly accumulated over the years. He loved it because of the silence. That extraordinary, impossible silence that exists in the half second before a wave takes you, when the entire ocean holds its breath and you hold yours. When the noise of the world, every worry, every deadline, every human complication dissolves completely. Just you and the water and the perfect, terrifying, beautiful now. Marcus had settled in a small beach community on the coast of New Zealand 3 years before the incident. He had followed a woman there, a marine biologist named Claire, who studied dolphin behavior, and who had laughed at one of his jokes at a conference in Sydney, and somehow never stopped laughing after that. They lived in a small white house 200 meters from the beach. There were surfboards in the hallway. There were tide charts on the kitchen wall. There was always sand on the floor no matter how many times either of them swept it up, and neither of them really minded. It was a good life, a quiet life, the kind of life that feels so solid and so right that you stop noticing how precious it is because you cannot imagine it ever being anything else. Claire understood his relationship with the ocean in a way that most people never could. She spent her own days in and around the water. She knew its moods. She respected its power, and she never once asked Marcus to be less of who he was. On the morning of the incident, she had kissed him goodbye at the door with a coffee cup in her hand and a case file tucked under her arm. "Waves look good," she had said, glancing past him toward the horizon. "Perfect," he had replied. She had smiled, and he had walked down to the beach. What made Marcus different from many surfers was not just his skill, it was his awareness. Years on the water had given him an almost instinctive ability to read the ocean, to notice things that others missed. The way a current shifted beneath the surface, the way birds behaved when something large moved through the water below them, the particular quality of silence that fell over the sea when the ecosystem beneath it was reacting to something unseen. He trusted those instincts completely. They had saved him more than once. A rip current off the coast of Portugal that he had felt before he saw it. A reef that rose too close to the surface in Indonesia, noticed from 30 meters away, because of the way the water colored above it. His instincts were sharp. His instincts were reliable. And on that morning, on that golden, perfect, heartbreakingly beautiful morning, his instincts told him absolutely nothing. The water felt clean. The energy felt right. The ocean, as far as every sense Marcus possessed could tell him, was exactly what it appeared to be. Safe, familiar, his. He had no way of knowing that somewhere beneath him, moving through the deep cold dark with effortless and terrifying grace, something had already noticed him. Something that outweighed him by 10,000 pounds. Something that was closing the distance between them one powerful, silent stroke at a time. The beach was called Kahurangi Point. It was not a famous beach. It was not the kind of place that appeared on travel posters or surfing magazines or the carefully curated social media feeds of professional athletes. There were no hotels nearby, no tourist shops, no rows of colorful umbrellas planted in the sand by resort staff every morning like clockwork. Kahurangi Point was the kind of beach that people who truly loved the ocean kept quietly to themselves. A hidden thing, a private thing, a long, sweeping arc of dark volcanic sand backed by rough coastal scrub, with headlands on either side that caught the swell and shaped it into long, clean, perfectly formed waves that peeled from right to left with a consistency that made serious surfers close their eyes and exhale slowly when they first saw it. Marcus had found it 8 months after arriving in New Zealand. He had driven 2 hours down a gravel road on a tip from a local fisherman who had drawn him a rough map on the back of a receipt. When he had crested the final hill and seen the bay spread out below, him in the late afternoon light waves perfectly stacked on the horizon, not a single person in the water, he had sat in his truck for a full 5 minutes without moving. Then he had driven down, pulled his board from the back, and paddled out. He had been coming back ever since. That morning, Marcus arrived at Kahurangi Point just before 7. The sky was doing something extraordinary, the kind of sunrise that feels almost unfair in its beauty. Deep layers of amber and rose stacked above the horizon, the clouds lit from beneath like lanterns, the light falling across the water in long golden ribbons that shifted and shimmered with every small movement of the surface. Marcus stood at the edge of the sand for a moment, board tucked under his arm, and simply looked. He had seen thousands of sunrises over the ocean, thousands of mornings exactly like this one, standing at the edge of the world with salt water ahead of him and everything else behind him. And still, it stopped him. Every single time, it stopped him. He shook his head slowly, smiled to himself, and walked into the water. The waves that morning were exceptional. 4 to 5 feet on the face, clean lines, barely any wind. The kind of conditions where every wave felt like it had been personally prepared for. Where the ocean seemed to be offering itself with an almost generous patience. There were 4 other surfers already in the water when Marcus paddled out. He recognized 2 of them, local guys named Damo. and Pete, brothers who surfed together every weekend and who greeted Marcus with the easy nod of people who have shared good waves many times without ever needing to say much about it. The other two were visitors. A young woman with a bright yellow board who surfed with a loose, flowing style that was genuinely beautiful to watch, and a teenager couldn't have been older than 16 who was clearly still learning but who threw himself at every wave with the fearless, slightly reckless energy of someone who had not yet learned to be afraid of the ocean. Marcus liked that energy. He remembered having it himself. For the first hour, everything was perfect. Marcus caught wave after wave with the effortless rhythm of a man completely in his element. His body remembered everything: the timing, the weight distribution, the subtle adjustments that turned a good ride into a great one. There was no thinking involved. There hadn't been for years. It was pure feeling, pure instinct, pure movement. On one particularly long wave, he rode almost the entire length of the break, a full 30 seconds of clean, fast, flowing surfing that ended with him stepping off the back of the board into knee-deep water with a quiet laugh of pure satisfaction. Damo paddled past him on the way back out. "Still got it, old man," he called. Marcus grinned. "Never lost it." He paddled back to the lineup. The sun was climbing now. The golden light had shifted to a brighter, cleaner white. The other surfers were laughing about something the teenager had taken a spectacular wipeout on, a close-out set wave, and was wearing a mouthful of seawater and a huge, embarrassed grin. It was one of those mornings that felt sealed and perfect, complete, the kind of morning you tuck away somewhere deep in your memory to return to later, on gray days when you need to remember that the world can be genuinely, uncomplicatedly good. It was somewhere around the 90-minute mark that Marcus first noticed something. He couldn't have said exactly what it was. Not yet. It was not dramatic. It was not obvious. It was simply a feeling. The particular quality of the water beneath his board shifting in some subtle way that did not match the waves or the current or the wind. He sat up on his board and looked around. The other surfers were still laughing and talking. The waves were still rolling in with the same clean consistency. The sky was still blue and wide and completely ordinary. Nothing was wrong. Everything looked exactly as it should. And yet, Marcus found himself scanning the water more carefully than usual, looking beyond the lineup, looking out toward the deeper water where the dark blue shifted to black and the bottom disappeared entirely. He saw nothing. He told himself he was imagining it. He lay back down on his board and prepared to paddle for the next wave. Then the birds left. It happened all at once. A group of seabirds that had been working the water 50 meters. Outside the lineup, diving, circling, riding the thermals with that loose, distracted energy that seabirds have when the fishing is good, simply stopped. They rose together, suddenly, as one, and flew away from the water without looking back. Marcus watched them go. His stomach tightened. In all his years on the ocean, he had learned to read birds the way other people read weather forecasts. And what those birds had just told him in their sudden, unanimous, wordless departure was that something below the surface had changed. Something had moved into the area. Something significant. He sat up again on his board, scanned the water, looked left toward the headland, looked right toward the open ocean. Still nothing. The surface was clean, unbroken, innocent. But beneath it, in the cold, dark fathoms below, where the light did not reach, and the pressure built, and the world operated by entirely different rules, something was rising. Slowly, deliberately, directly beneath the spot where Marcus Webb sat on his surfboard with his feet trailing in the water, not knowing, not seeing, not ready. It happened in the space between one heartbeat and the next. No warning, no build-up. No final moment of terrible clarity where Marcus could have done anything differently. 1 second he was lying flat on his board, arms pulling through the water, eyes fixed on the approaching wave, every muscle in his body operating on the beautiful autopilot of a man who had done this 10,000 times before. And then the ocean exploded. The Orca came from directly below, not from the side, not from behind. From below, straight up, like something launched from the deepest part of the earth with a single catastrophic purpose. It struck the underside of Marcus's surfboard with a force that did not feel like an animal. It felt like a vehicle, like something mechanical, like the world's largest piston firing upward through the ocean floor and connecting with everything above. It in one violent, world-ending instant. The surfboard, a 6'4" performance shortboard that Marcus had ridden for 2 years and trusted, completely shattered. Not cracked, not broken in two. Shattered. Fragments of fiberglass and foam exploded outward in every direction like shrapnel. The leg rope, the cord connecting the board to Marcus's ankles, snapped under the force like a piece of cotton thread. And Marcus went up, into the air, higher than physics should have. Allowed. Higher than the mind can properly process when it replays the moment later, in the quiet dark, trying to make sense of something that refused to make sense. Witnesses on the beach would later say he cleared the water by at least 8 feet. 8 feet. A human body. Launched into the air by the raw, explosive power of a 30-foot apex predator moving at full speed from the deep. For one impossible, suspended moment he was flying. Then gravity remembered him. He hit the water hard. Chest first. The impact drove every molecule of air from his lungs in a single brutal instant. The cold rushed in from every direction, crushing, disorienting, absolute. He did not know which way was up. He did not know where the surface was. He did not know where the Orca was. He knew nothing except the cold and the dark and the desperate animal panic of a body that had lost all of its oxygen and had no idea how to find more. He kicked, wildly, blindly. Arms and legs churning through water. That felt thick and hostile and completely indifferent to whether he lived or died. His hand broke the surface first, then his head. He gasped, a ragged, tearing sound that he would not have recognized as coming from himself if someone had played it back to him later. Air, cold and salt-sharp, and the most beautiful thing he had ever tasted. He gulped it down. Once, twice, and then he heard the screaming from the beach. On shore, the scene had transformed in an instant from a peaceful morning to something out of a nightmare. The 4 other surfers in the water had seen it happen. Damo had been 20 meters to Marcus's left when the Orca surfaced. He would later tell investigators that the size of it, the sheer, incomprehensible size of the animal as it came out of the water, had short-circuited something in his brain. His body had simply stopped working for a full 3 seconds. He could not paddle. He could not shout. He could not move. He just watched. Pete had reacted differently. Pure instinct had taken over, and he had started paddling toward shore before he even consciously understood what he was doing. His body had made the decision for him, and it had made it fast. The young woman with the yellow board had screamed, once, sharp and high, and cut off abruptly as if even her voice could not sustain the sound of what her eyes were telling her. The teenager had simply disappeared. One moment he was there, the next he was sprinting through the shallows toward the beach, with a speed that would have impressed anyone under different circumstances. On the sand, the handful of people who had been watching the surfers from shore had their phones out within seconds, not to call for help, not yet, because the human brain, confronted with something it has never seen and cannot categorize, does something strange. It records, as if capturing the image will somehow help it understand. Marcus was treading water. His board was gone. His leg rope was gone. He had nothing beneath him and nothing to hold on to in approximately 200 meters of open water between himself and the beach. He turned in the water, trying to locate the Orca. The surface around him was churned and white from the violence of what had just happened. Fragments of his board floated in a wide circle around him, pale pieces of foam and fiberglass drifting with a horrible casualness, like debris after an explosion. He could not see the Orca, which was, in some ways, worse than seeing it. Because somewhere beneath him, somewhere in that cold black world below the reach of sunlight, 30 feet and 20,000 pounds of the ocean's most powerful predator was moving. And he did not know where. And he did not know why, and he did not know if it was coming back. It came back, not with violence this time. The Orca surfaced 12 meters to Marcus's left, slowly, deliberately, the enormous black and white head rising from the water with a terrible, unhurried grace, the 6-foot dorsal fin cutting the surface like a blade, the eye, that extraordinary dark, intelligent eye, breaking the waterline and fixing itself on the man floating in the water nearby. Marcus froze. Every survival instinct he possessed screamed at him to move, to swim, to do something. But a deeper instinct, something older and quieter and somehow wiser, told him to be still. He was still. The orca was still, for a moment that lasted both a fraction of a second and approximately 10,000 years negative. They looked at each other, man and animal, predator and prey, two creatures from entirely different worlds, separated by 12 meters of cold salt water and an almost infinite gulf of mutual incomprehension looking at each other. Marcus felt something in that moment that he would spend years trying to articulate and never quite manage. It was not fear. He was beyond fear by that point. Fear requires the belief that the worst might not happen. Marcus had already left that territory far behind. It was not peace either. He was not one of those people who claimed the near-death experience brought them serenity. It did not. What he felt was recognition, some deep, wordless, biological acknowledgement passing between two living things at the absolute edge of everything. An awareness, on some level below language and reason and conscious thought, that they were both real, both present, both in whatever way mattered most alive. The orca blinked, and then it did something that nobody on that beach, nobody in any boat, nobody watching the shaky footage on their phone screens would be able to fully explain for months afterward. Something that would make scientists argue, something that would make headlines, something that would change the way Marcus Webb understood the ocean and himself and the thin, extraordinary line between living and not living forever. But before we get to that, you need to understand what the next 60 seconds looked like from the beach. While Marcus floated in the water 12 meters from a 30-foot killer whale, and while the orca did what it did, nobody on shore was breathing. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. They stood in a line at the water's edge, strangers bound together by the single most extraordinary thing any of them had ever witnessed, and they watched. And every single one of them, in every account they gave afterward, used exactly the same word to describe what they saw. Impossible. The human body is a remarkable thing. In moments of extreme crisis, in the seconds and minutes following a trauma so overwhelming that the conscious mind simply cannot process it, the body takes over. It makes decisions. It sets priorities. It does what it needs to do with a cold, efficient clarity that the thinking brain could never match under the same circumstances. Marcus Webb's body made 3 decisions in rapid succession. Stay on the surface. Keep breathing. Do not look down. He was bleeding. He knew it before he could see it. Could feel it, a warm, spreading sensation across his right shoulder and down his left leg that stood in sharp, almost surreal contrast to the cold of the water surrounding him. The initial impact of the orca's strike had not been a bite. The animal had hit the underside of his board, not him directly, but the explosion of the board itself had done damage. A jagged shard of fiberglass had opened a deep gash across his right shoulder, tearing through the thin material of his wetsuit and into the flesh beneath. His left leg had connected with something, the edge of the board, possibly the tail of the animal itself, and the impact had left a wound below his knee that was bleeding steadily into the water around him. He looked down at the water. It was turning pink. The sight of it, that slow, terrible blossoming of color spreading outward from his body in delicate tendrils, hit Marcus with a clarity that cut straight through the shock that had been insulating him from full awareness. He was wounded. He was alone. He was 200 meters from shore. And somewhere beneath him, a 30-foot orca was doing something he could not see and could not predict. The orca had submerged again. After that long, extraordinary moment of stillness, that impossible locked gaze between man and animal that had frozen every witness on the beach, the creature had simply slipped beneath the surface. No drama, no violence, no warning. One moment it was there, the next moment the water was flat and unbroken and gave no indication that anything had ever been there at all, which should have been a relief. It was not a relief, because Marcus understood the ocean well enough to know that the absence of a predator on the surface means nothing, less than nothing. It means only that the predator has chosen not to be visible. It means only that whatever is happening below, in the dark, beyond the reach of human eyes. He turned slowly in the water. 160 degrees, scanning the surface in every direction. Nothing. He could hear shouting from the beach now, voices carrying across the water, urgent, overlapping, impossible to make out as individual words, but unmistakable in their collective tone. Panic. Help was coming, but help was not here yet, and between Marcus and the shore lay 200 meters of open water that felt, in that moment, like the most dangerous 200 meters on the surface of the earth. He started to swim, not with the clean, powerful strokes of a confident ocean swimmer, with the careful, measured movements of a man who was acutely aware that every motion he made sent vibrations through the water. Every kick, every arm pull, every displacement of liquid around his body radiating outward in all directions like a signal. He had read enough about shark behavior to know that erratic, splashing movement attracted predators. He had no idea if the same principle applied to orcas. He suspected it might. So he swam with a terrible, deliberate control that cost him more energy than thrashing wildly would have. Kept his kicks small and even beneath the surface. Kept his arms pulling long and smooth. Kept his breathing as steady as he could manage, which was not very steady at all. His shoulder burned with every stroke. The left leg was beginning to stiffen. The cold of the water was working against him now, slowing his muscles, thickening his blood, making every movement fractionally harder than the last. He had been in the water since before 7. It was approaching 9. The early morning temperature of the New Zealand coastal water in this region hovered around 14 degrees Celsius, cold enough to cause problems, cold enough over time to cause serious problems. He kept swimming. On the beach, Damo had reached shore and was already on his phone. Emergency services, Coast Guard, anyone who could get something in the water fast. His hands were shaking so badly he misdialed twice before the call connected. When the operator answered, he spoke quickly and clearly: location, situation, number of people in the water, nature of the threat, with a focus that surprised even him, given that his entire body felt like it was made of something unreliable. Pete had waded back into the shallows and was shouting Marcus's name across the water. Not useful, practically speaking, but necessary somehow. The kind of thing a person does when standing still is simply not an option, and there is nothing else available. The young woman with the yellow board, her name was Aroha, and she would become an important part of this story before it was over, had not stopped moving since the moment the Orca surfaced. She had sprinted to her car in the small gravel lot above the beach and returned in under 2 minutes with a rope, a first aid kit, and a calm, purposeful expression that was entirely at odds with the situation. She stood at the water's edge and watched Marcus swimming, counting his strokes, calculating the distance, thinking. Marcus had covered perhaps 60 meters when he felt it. Not saw, not heard, felt. A pressure change in the water beneath him. A subtle but unmistakable shift in the way the ocean moved against his body, the particular sensation of something very large displacing very large amounts of water somewhere below. Close! He stopped swimming, lay flat in the water, and went completely still. His heart was hammering so hard he could feel it in his teeth. His breath came in shallow, controlled pulls that he forced through sheer will to remain quiet. The wound on his shoulder pulsed with a hot, insistent pain that he pushed to the furthest corner of his awareness and held there. The water moved beneath him. Again, closer. He closed his eyes. Not in resignation. Not in prayer, exactly. Though it was closer to prayer than anything else he could name. He closed his eyes because he had done everything he could do. He had swum, controlled his movement. He had stayed calm under circumstances that would have shattered most people completely. And now, the ocean was going to do what the ocean was going to do. He had always known this about the sea. Had always understood, beneath all the love and the joy and the 28 years of surfing its waves, that the ocean did not belong to him. That it had never belonged to him. That every single morning he paddled out was a kind of permission granted quietly, without ceremony, by something vast and ancient and entirely indifferent to his plans. The water moved again, and then something touched his leg. On the beach, Aroha dropped the rope. Pete stopped shouting. Damo, still on the phone, with the emergency operator, went completely silent mid-sentence. Every person on that beach saw what happened next, And every person on that beach in the days and weeks and months that followed, in every interview and statement and quiet private conversation, struggled to find words adequate to describe it, because what the orca did in that moment was not what any of them expected, not even close. The touch was gentle. That was the first thing Marcus registered, the first thing that pierced through the wall of terror that had sealed itself around every functioning part of his brain the moment he felt movement beneath him. It was gentle, not the explosive, annihilating force of the initial strike, not the predatory aggression of an animal finishing what it had started, not even the careless, incidental contact of something enormous moving past something small without particular concern for the consequences. It was deliberate, and it was soft. The orca's rostrum, the rounded, powerful front of its head, made contact with Marcus's left leg with a pressure that he would later compare. In an interview that left the journalist visibly struggling to maintain professional composure, to the nudge of a very large, very insistent dog asking to be let outside. Purposeful, almost careful. Marcus opened his eyes. The orca was beside him now, not below, not circling. Beside him, parallel to his body, close enough that he could see the individual variations in the animal's black and white patterning, close enough that he could hear the wet, pneumatic sound of its breathing through the blowhole positioned just behind its head, close enough to reach out and touch. He did not reach out and touch it. He did not move at all. He floated. He breathed. He looked at the orca, and the orca looked at him, and the entire universe contracted to the 12 inches of cold salt water separating a 34-year-old man from the most powerful predator in the ocean. And then the orca nudged him again. Same spot, same gentle, deliberate pressure, but this time with direction, toward shore. Marcus felt it so clearly that for a moment he genuinely questioned his own perception. He had taken a significant physical impact less than 10 minutes ago. He had lost blood. He had been treading cold water while running on nothing but adrenaline and sheer stubborn will. His brain, he reasoned, was not operating under ideal conditions. He was probably imagining the direction. He was probably projecting meaning onto random animal behavior, the way traumatized human minds project meaning onto everything, desperately pattern matching a chaotic world into something that makes sense. He was probably wrong. The orca nudged him a third time, toward shore. Unmistakably, undeniably, geometrically toward shore. On the beach, nobody was breathing. Aroha had her hand pressed flat against her mouth, not a gesture she was aware of making. Her body had made it for her. Some automatic physical response to witnessing something that her mind could not yet file into any existing category. Damo had lowered his phone from his ear entirely. The emergency operator was still talking. He could hear the tiny, distant voice asking for updates, asking if the victim was still visible. Asking, and he could not respond because responding would have required him to look away from the water. And he was not capable of looking away from the water. Pete had walked in up to his waist without realizing it. The cold of it registered somewhere in the background of his awareness, and he ignored it completely. He was watching. His eyes were wide and his mouth was open, and he was watching with the total, unblinking attention of a man witnessing something he would spend the rest of his life trying to describe to people who would never quite believe him. The footage from 3 separate phones on that beach would later be viewed over 40 million times across the internet. And still, even with the footage, people argued about what they were seeing. Because what the orca was doing had no clean explanation. No tidy scientific framework that snapped into place and made everything comfortable and categorized and understood. What the orca was doing was shepherding him. There is no other word for it, no more precise term, no more accurate description. The animal moved alongside Marcus in the water, matching his pace exactly, adjusting its position with minute, careful corrections every time Marcus's direction drifted, and it guided him, steadily, patiently, with a consistency of purpose that would have been remarkable in a trained animal responding to practice commands. This was a wild orca, in open ocean, guiding a bleeding, exhausted human being toward shore. Marine biologist Dr. Yuki Tanaka, who would become one of the most quoted voices in the media storm that followed this incident, later described watching the footage for the first time in her university office in Wellington. She watched it once, then she watched it again. Then she sat back in her chair and was quiet for a very long time. When her graduate student asked her what she thought, she chose her words with the extreme care of a scientist who understood exactly how much weight they would carry. She said that orca behavior in the wild was complex, context-dependent, and frequently misinterpreted by human observers who brought their own emotional frameworks to what they were seeing. She said that anthropomorphizing animal behavior, projecting human intentions and emotions onto creatures operating within entirely different cognitive systems, was one of the most common and most significant errors in popular wildlife interpretation. She said all of this carefully and completely. And then she said, "But I have studied orca behavior for 19 years, and I have never seen anything like this." Marcus had stopped trying to explain it to himself. Somewhere around the fourth nudge, somewhere around the moment when the orca had gently but unmistakably corrected his drift to the left and repositioned him on a straighter line toward the beach, he had made a quiet internal decision to simply accept what was happening and deal with the question of what it meant later. He was a surfer. He was a practical man. He was bleeding and cold and exhausted and 200 meters from shore. He would swim. The orca would do what the orca would do, and he would. Think about all of it later, in a warm room, when his hands had stopped shaking. He swam. The orca stayed with him for the entire distance. 140 meters of open water, covered in slow and careful increments, with 30 feet of apex predator moving alongside him like an escort, like a guardian, like something that had made a decision in whatever language decisions are made in a mind that operates entirely outside the boundaries of human comprehension, that this particular human being was going to reach the shore. When Marcus was close enough to the beach that his feet touched bottom, when he stood up for the first time, in what felt like a different lifetime, when the water dropped from his chest to his waist and the solid, reliable ground beneath him became real, and he took the first stumbling steps toward the sand, he turned back. The orca was still there, sitting in the water at the edge of the shallows, still watching that dark, extraordinary eye above the waterline, watching him. Marcus stood in the shallows and looked back at it. He was shaking from cold and shock, and something else that he couldn't name and still cannot name. His shoulder was bleeding, and his leg was stiff, and Aroha was already waiting toward him with the first aid. Kit and Pete was right behind her, and Damo was back on the phone with the emergency operator saying he is up. He is standing. He made it, but Marcus didn't hear any of it. Not yet. For 3 more seconds he stood in that cold water and looked at the orca, and the orca looked at him. And then, with a movement of such fluid, effortless grace that it seemed to belong to a different category of physics than the rest of the world, the orca sank beneath the surface and was gone, as if it had never been there, as if the last 15 minutes had been a dream constructed by an exhausted, traumatized brain trying to make sense of something that had no sense available to be made of it. Except 3 phones had been recording. 40 million people would watch the footage, and not one of them, not one, would be able to look away. Aroha reached him first. She came through the shallows at a pace that was somewhere between a wade and a run, the water fighting her every step, pulling at her legs, slowing her down in that maddening way that water does when urgency demands speed and physics refuses to cooperate. She had the first aid kit open before she even reached him. That was the kind of person Aroha Ngata was. 26 years old, former volunteer surf lifesaver, currently a trainee paramedic in her 2nd year of clinical placement at a hospital 40 minutes up the coast. She had grown up on this coastline, had pulled 2 people from rips before her 18th birthday, had performed CPR on a fisherman who had collapsed on the rocks south of the headland 3 summers ago, and had kept him alive for 11 minutes until the ambulance arrived. She was not someone who stood at the water's edge and watched. She was someone who moved. Marcus was standing, but only just. The moment his feet had found solid ground, the adrenaline that had been holding him together began its inevitable retreat. It happened fast, the way it always does, the body running hot and sharp and impossibly capable during the crisis itself, and then the moment the immediate danger passes, sending the bill for everything it borrowed. His legs were shaking, not trembling. shaking with the deep, involuntary violence of muscles that had been asked to perform under extreme cold and extreme stress for far longer than they were designed to. His shoulder had soaked the upper half of his wetsuit a deep, dark red. His face, Aroha would later say, had the particular gray-white color of someone whose body was making urgent internal calculations about what it could afford to keep running and what it needed to shut down. She grabbed his arm, steadied him, looked him directly in the eyes. "I've got you," she said. "You're out. You're safe. Look at me." Marcus looked at her. "Can you walk?" He considered the question with the slow seriousness of a man for whom walking had suddenly become a complex philosophical proposition. "Yeah," he said. "I think so." "Then walk. Lean on me. We're going up the beach." He walked. Pete and Damo were right behind them. Pete took Marcus's other arm without being asked, the instinctive, wordless coordination of people responding to a crisis together. Damo stayed on, the phone relaying information to the emergency operator in a continuous stream as they moved up the beach. "He's out of the water. He's walking. There's a deep laceration on the right shoulder. Looks like maybe 6-7 centimeters, bleeding heavily. Left leg below the knee, smaller wound, still bleeding. He's conscious and talking. We're moving him up the beach away from the water." The operator told him an ambulance had been dispatched from Westport. Estimated arrival 22 minutes. She also told him the Coast Guard had been notified and that a helicopter had been requested. 22 minutes. Damo looked at Marcus's shoulder and said nothing about the 22 minutes. Aroha worked fast. She got Marcus sitting on the dry sand above the tide line with his back against a piece of driftwood large enough to support him. She unzipped the top of his wetsuit and peeled it away from his shoulder with the careful efficiency of someone who had practiced this, who had run through these exact motions enough times that her hands knew what to do independently of whatever her mind was feeling about the situation. What she saw was bad enough to require a controlled breath and a deliberate reset before she continued. The fiberglass shard had opened a wound that was deep and ragged and bleeding with a persistence that confirmed it had caught something meaningful beneath the surface. Not arterial, the blood was dark rather than bright, and the flow, while significant, was not the pulsing catastrophic hemorrhage that would have made the next 22 minutes a very different kind of story. But serious, definitely serious. She packed the wound with the sterile gauze from the kit and applied direct pressure with both hands and told Marcus to hold it there while she looked at his leg. "Does this hurt?" she asked, pressing carefully around the wound below his knee. "Everything hurts," Marcus said. "That's a yes then. That's a yes." The teenager whose name was Finn and who had sprinted from the water to the beach with the uncomplicated animal instinct of someone whose body had not yet learned to second-guess itself had recovered enough from his initial shock to be useful. He had found a thermal emergency blanket in Aroha's car. She kept one in the boot, along with the first aid kit, part of a habit she had developed early in her paramedic training and maintained without thinking, and had brought it down to the beach at a run. He wrapped it around Marcus's shoulders with slightly too much enthusiasm and slightly too little technique, but with a genuine, uncomplicated urgency that made Aroha briefly and unexpectedly want to cry. She did not cry. She kept her hands on the wound and kept her eyes on Marcus and kept counting seconds in the back of her mind the way she had been trained to do. Marcus was starting to talk. This was a good sign and a complicated sign simultaneously. It meant his brain was functioning. It meant the shock had not taken him to that quiet, dangerous place where people stopped responding and started going somewhere else. But what he was saying was difficult to follow. "It nudged me," he said. "Did you see it? Did anyone see it nudge me?" "We saw," Pete said. He was crouching in the sand beside Marcus, close enough to catch him if he listed sideways. "Everyone saw. It was pushing me toward shore." "I know. That doesn't—" Marcus stopped, shook his head, started again. "That doesn't make any sense." "No," Pete agreed. "It doesn't." Marcus looked out at the water. The surface was calm and clean and gave nothing away. The ocean looked exactly as it had looked at 7 that morning, beautiful and vast and completely, serenely indifferent, as if nothing had happened, as if the last 90 minutes had been a story told by someone else about someone else in some other place.
Is it still out there?
Marcus asked. Nobody answered immediately, because nobody knew. The ambulance arrived in 19 minutes. 3 minutes ahead of the estimated time, a fact that the paramedic driving would later attribute to a clear road and a particular quality of urgency that had come through in Damo's voice during the emergency call. Something in the way he had described what happened, something that had made the driver press a little harder on the accelerator than the protocol strictly required. The two paramedics who stepped out of the vehicle moved with the same quality that Aroha had, that practiced, purposeful calm that is not the absence of urgency, but the discipline of people who have learned to convert urgency into function rather than noise. They assessed Marcus quickly, replaced Aroha's field dressing with a proper wound pack, checked his vitals, asked him questions in that particular paramedic cadence, steady, even, almost conversational, that is specifically designed to keep a patient's brain engaged and present and on the right side of consciousness. His blood pressure was low. His temperature was dropping. His responses were clear but slowing. They made the call for the helicopter. As the stretcher carried Marcus Webb up the beach toward the waiting ambulance, as Aroha walked alongside him with her hand on his arm, and Pete and Damo followed in the particular dazed silence of people who had witnessed something their brains were still actively trying to file, as Finn stood at the water's edge with the sun behind him and watched the ocean with the wide, newly rearranged eyes of a 16-year-old who had arrived that morning expecting an ordinary surf session and was leaving with something he would carry for the rest of his life. The surface of the water broke. 200 meters out, a dorsal fin, 6 feet tall, rising slowly above the surface, staying there for a moment that felt much longer than it was, and then sliding silently back beneath the waves. Gone. The hospital ceiling was white. That was the first thing Marcus focused on when the anesthesia released him back into the world. Not the beeping of the monitors beside his bed, not the antiseptic smell that had soaked into every surface of the room, not the distant sounds of the ward beyond the door trolleys moving, voices calling, the ordinary busy machinery of a place built around the fragile border between living and not living. Just the ceiling, white and still and completely mercifully uneventful. He stared at it for a long time. The surgery had taken 2 hours and 40 minutes. The wound on his shoulder had been deeper than Aroha's field assessment had indicated. The fiberglass shard had missed the brachial artery by a margin that the surgical team described, with the particular careful understatement of medical professionals, as significant. The muscle damage would require extensive rehabilitation. The scarring would be permanent. His left leg had needed 12 stitches below the knee and a course of antibiotics to address the contamination risk from the seawater that had entered the wound during the 200-meter swim to shore. He had also, it turned out, cracked 2 ribs on the right side, an injury from the initial impact that the adrenaline had masked so completely during the incident that Marcus had not even been aware of it until the paramedic pressed carefully along his rib cage in the ambulance, and he had made a sound that he was not proud of. The doctor who delivered this summary sat at the edge of Marcus's bed with the clipboard on her knee and ran through the list of injuries in a measured, professional tone that somehow made the whole thing feel both very serious and entirely manageable simultaneously. "You are going to be fine," she said at the end. Marcus nodded. "You are also extraordinarily lucky," she added, not as a throwaway, as a statement of clinical fact delivered by someone who had seen enough of the opposite to understand precisely what she was saying. Marcus nodded again. He already knew. Claire was in the chair beside his bed when he woke properly. She had driven the 2 hours from home in a state that she would later describe simply as not good, which, knowing Claire, Marcus understood to be a significant understatement. She was a marine biologist who spent her professional life thinking clearly and dispassionately about the ocean and the creatures in it. She was not, by nature or training, someone given to panic, but she had arrived at the hospital with her coat on inside out and had not noticed until a nurse gently pointed it out 3 hours later. She was holding his hand when he opened his eyes. She did not say anything for a moment. Neither did he. There are conversations that don't begin with words, that begin with the simple, overwhelming fact of presence of one person sitting beside another person and both of them being aware, in the most cellular and fundamental way possible, of how different this moment could have been. They sat in that awareness together for a little while. Then Claire said very quietly, "Tell me everything." And he did. The media arrived on the second day. Marcus had expected it. The footage had already spread across the internet with the velocity that only genuinely extraordinary things achieve, not the manufactured virality of staged content or algorithm-optimized outrage, but the real, unstoppable spread of something that people watched and immediately needed someone else to watch too. 40 million views had become 60 million, then 80, then a number that the platforms themselves seemed uncertain how to display. He gave one interview from his hospital bed, a single, carefully chosen journalist from a publication he respected. He spoke for 40 minutes. He was honest about what he remembered. He was careful about what he claimed to understand. When the journalist asked him what he thought the Orca's behavior meant, why it had done what it did, Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that would be quoted more than anything else from the entire incident. He said, "I don't know, and I think that's the most important part. I genuinely don't know, and I'm not sure I'm supposed to." The rehabilitation was long, longer than the doctors initially projected, and longer than Marcus's impatience wanted to accept. 6 weeks of restricted movement for the shoulder, 3 months of formal physiotherapy after that, a graduated return to physical activity that felt, to a man who had been in the ocean every day for most of his adult life, like a particular and exquisite form of torture. He could not surf. He had not expected how much that would cost him. Not just physically, not just in terms of the restlessness and the disrupted rhythm of a life built around the water, but psychologically, emotionally, in the deep structural way that losing access to the thing that makes you most yourself costs you. He had nightmares. He did not talk about this publicly for a long time. He talked about it with Claire. He talked about it with a psychologist named Dr. Rachel Ford, who specialized in trauma recovery and who had a quiet, unhurried way of listening that Marcus found, to his own surprise, genuinely useful. The nightmares were not always about the Orca. Sometimes they were about the moment of impact, the board exploding, the sensation of being launched into the air. Sometimes they were about the water, the pinkness of it spreading from his body, the cold, the terrible vulnerability of treading water above something he could not see. And sometimes, most strangely, most persistently, the nightmares were about the eye, that dark, extraordinary, intelligent eye above the waterline, looking at him. In the dreams it was never threatening. It was simply present, watching, with an expression that Marcus's sleeping brain kept trying to read and kept failing to translate into anything his waking vocabulary contained. He told Dr. Ford about the eye dreams. She listened carefully. Then she asked him how the dreams made him feel. Marcus thought about it for a long time. "Seen," he finally said. "They make me feel seen." He returned to the water for the first time 4 months after the incident. Not surfing, not yet. Just standing at the edge of the ocean at Kahurangi Point in the early morning light, with his feet in the shallows and the cold of it working its way up through his soles, and Claire standing quietly beside him. He had thought he might feel fear. He had prepared for fear, had discussed strategies for managing it with Dr. Ford, had constructed careful mental frameworks for confronting the anxiety he fully expected to arrive the moment the water touched his skin. What he felt instead was complicated. There was fear in it. He would not pretend otherwise. A low, steady hum of awareness that lived in his chest and reminded him, quietly but consistently, of exactly what this water was and exactly what it contained. But underneath, fear deeper than the fear was something else entirely. Something that felt, if he was being completely honest with himself, which he had decided, somewhere in the long, quiet months of recovery, to always be like gratitude, raw and irrational and entirely real. Gratitude for the ceiling of a hospital room, for a coat worn inside out, for 12 stitches and cracked ribs and a shoulder that ached when the weather changed, for the particular, irreplaceable fact of still being here to feel. All of it. He stood in the shallows for a long time, The ocean moved around his feet the way it always had, indifferent and ancient and magnificent. And somewhere out beyond the break, the deep water waited, dark and cold and full of things he would never fully understand. And Marcus Webb looked out at it and felt, for the first time in 4 months, like himself. Some stories change the people inside them. And some stories, the rarest kind, change the people watching from the outside too. This was one of those stories. In the weeks and months that followed the incident at Kahurangi Point, something quietly extraordinary happened. Not in the headlines, not in the scientific journals, though there were plenty of those. Not in the television segments and podcast episodes in university lecture halls where the footage was played and replayed and examined from every possible angle by every possible kind of expert. It happened in the comments sections, in the messages people sent to strangers, in the conversations that started at dinner tables and on morning commutes, and in the particular late-night hours when people find themselves thinking about things larger than their immediate lives. People could not stop talking about what they had seen. And more importantly, they could not stop talking about what it meant. The scientific community responded with the careful, measured language of people whose professional credibility depends on saying only what the evidence will support. Dr. Yuki Tanaka published a paper in a peer-reviewed marine biology journal 3 months after the incident. It was 47 pages long. It examined the footage frame by frame. It considered every possible behavioral explanation: displacement behavior, play behavior, redirected aggression, prey investigation, social curiosity, with the thorough, dispassionate rigor of genuine scientific inquiry. Her conclusion, reached after 47 pages of extraordinarily careful analysis, was stated in a single paragraph at the end. She wrote that the behavior observed in the footage was unlike any previously documented wild orca interaction with a human being, that none of the existing behavioral frameworks provided a complete or satisfying explanation for what was seen, that further research was required, that conclusions should be drawn with extreme caution. And then, in the final sentence of the final paragraph of a 47-page scientific paper, she wrote something that no one in her field expected her to write. She wrote that science was very good at measuring what animals did, and that it remained, despite everything, genuinely humble about the question of why. That question why became the heartbeat of every conversation the footage generated. Why did the orca strike in the first place? Why did it return? Why did it behave in a way that every witness described, regardless of their background or belief system or prior knowledge of marine biology? Protective? The honest answer, the only intellectually defensible answer, was that nobody knew, and that not knowing was not a failure. It was an invitation to sit with the uncomfortable, expansive, genuinely thrilling possibility that the natural world contains depths of complexity and intelligence and perhaps intention that human understanding has barely begun to map. We share this planet with creatures that have been here longer than us, that have evolved over millions of years into forms of intelligence so different from our own that we lack even the basic conceptual vocabulary to properly describe them. We study them, we categorize them, we name their behaviors and map their migration routes and sequence their genomes, and still they surprise us. Still, on an ordinary Tuesday morning on a quiet beach in New Zealand, a 30-foot wild orca does something that 47 pages of careful science cannot fully explain, and the world watches the footage 80 million times and feels something true, something important, something it doesn't quite have words for either. Marcus returned to surfing 5 months after the incident, not at Kahurangi Point, not yet. At a smaller, gentler break closer to home. A beginner's wave, really the kind of soft, forgiving shore break where parents taught children and older surfers came to rest their joints on easy days. He paddled out alone in the early morning before anyone else arrived. Paddle out felt different than it ever had before. Every stroke through the water was something he was aware of in a way he had never been aware of it before the incident. The temperature of it, the weight of it, the way it moved against his palms and between his fingers and along the length of his arms. He had surfed this same motion 10,000 times without truly feeling it. He felt it now. He sat on his board in the lineup and looked at the horizon and breathed. The first wave that came to him was small, gentle, entirely unintimidating by any objective measure. He paddled for it anyway, and he stood up, wobbly, careful, with none of the fluid automatic confidence of the surfer he had been 5 months ago, and all of the deliberate, wide-eyed presence of someone doing something for what felt in every way that mattered like the very first time. He rode it to the sand, stepped off the back of the board into knee-deep water, and laughed. The same laugh he had laughed at 6 years, old with his father's hands letting go. The same laugh, after everything, the same laugh. What the ocean taught Marcus Webb, what it carved into him in those 90 minutes at Kahurangi Point, with more precision and permanence than any experience of his previous 34 years, was something simple, not comfortable, not reassuring in the way that lessons in stories are often reassuring, just true. He did not own the ocean. He had never owned it, had never been its master or its conqueror or anything other than a temporary, welcome guest moving across its surface by its permission and its grace. Every wave he had ever caught had been a gift. Every morning he had paddled out had been a conversation between himself and something vast and ancient and operating by rules that existed long before he arrived and would continue long after he was gone. The Orca had not attacked him out of malice. It had not rescued him out of kindness. It had simply been itself, completely, magnificently, terrifyingly itself. An apex predator in its own world, operating by its own logic, making its own decisions for its own reasons in a language Marcus did not speak and would never speak. And in being itself so completely, it had shown him something about what it meant to be himself, to be present, to be alive. To stop moving through the world on autopilot and actually feel every cold stroke of water against every open palm. There is a photograph that Claire took on the morning Marcus returned to Kahurangi Point for the first time. He is standing at the water's edge, surfboard under his arm. The sun is low and the light is gold, and the waves are doing what they always do, rolling in from the deep, breaking, spending themselves completely on the shore, and pulling back to begin again. He is looking at the ocean. His expression is not fear. It is not bravado either. It is something rarer than both. It is the face of a man who has looked into the eye of something ancient and enormous and incomprehensible and come back from it knowing something he did not know before. Not an answer. Something better than an answer. A question he will spend the rest of his life being grateful to carry. The ocean does not belong to us. It never did. We are visitors here, brief and fragile and luminous in our brevity. And if we are very lucky, if we are paying attention, it will show us something true about ourselves. Something we could not have found anywhere else. Something we would not trade for anything in the world.